problem in his time and the basic cause of the horrors of the 30 Years' War, from which Germany then was painfully emerging, but also introduces the problem and faces the challenge that free thinking and libertinism, the challenge that these posed to European society in his time and to the moral order as most people understood it in his time, and to theology, the dominant discipline of his time. A challenge indeed to all those that base their conception of reality and morality on natural theology. Free thinking, no less than defective religion, was a prime target of the Leibnizian Enlightenment. Leibniz cites favorable upbringing, associating with pious persons, and other factors that may contribute to forging the right moral attitudes in individuals, but accepting good principles, he thinks, performs more and better service, does more practical work towards upholding the existing order than anything else. In this respect, I see Leibniz as a quintessential early Enlightenment philosopher. Many historians in recent works, and John Robertson in his Case for Enlightenment, a good book, came out just a few years ago, have defined the Enlightenment essentially as a program to improve, to seek human betterment in this world through innovations of different kinds, as he describes it. But not many put the emphasis on philosophy as the agent of change that I think most Enlighteners themselves were inclined to do, and as Leibniz himself very clearly does. And in that respect, he seems to me utterly representative of what the moderate Enlightenment was. Quintessential representative of the Enlightenment in general. So this is to assign prime responsibility for ordering society rightly and correctly, a tremendous worldly task, to philosophy. To see philosophy, as most Enlighteners in fact did, as the chief agent of improvement, betterment, and change in human life, and in his case, doing so, offering a richer and wider harmony of enlightenment, or harmony, togetherness of enlightenment with theism, religion, and tradition than any other great mind of the 17th and 18th centuries. Not only do religious people mostly fail to uphold true moral values which rest on natural theology, but so also, of course, in Leibniz's eyes, does Bayle with his fideistic doctrine. Tom Lennon said at the beginning of this conference, and it is indeed very usual still to describe Bayle as a skeptic, but I am entirely unable to see that Bayle is a skeptic at all. And quite a number of recent works on Bayle have stressed the not so much the skepticism. Certainly he was skeptical about anything anyone believed, but whether he was skeptical about reason is another matter entirely, and I think it's possible, in fact, very convincing to argue that Bayle was no skeptic and that the fideism is really a pseudo-fideism. And I think that Leibniz, of course, always courteous and gentle, is perfectly willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on his fideism, but a lot of the time it seems to me there's a slightly questioning aspect to the way he's describing Bayle's views, which could well imply that he doesn't in fact see him as a genuine fideist either. So he sees Bayle as a fideist, or is willing to see Bayle as a fideist, recognizing no reasonable basis for belief in the overriding goodness of God. This means that Bayle and the fideists are presenting us with a God unworthy of veneration, as far as Leibniz is concerned, as are in a different way all those conventionally religious people fixated on ceremonies and dogmas that Leibniz criticizes. They have all conceived of despotic power when they should rather have conceived of a power ordered by the most perfect wisdom. Bayle is a profoundly disturbing and threatening influence in philosophy because he wishes to infer, in quoting, he wishes to infer that our reason is confounded and cannot meet her own objections, and that one should disregard them and hold fast to the revealed dogmas. When I say pseudo-fideist, of course, Bayle often will say, well, you can't make faith and reason converge at this point or at that point or another point, therefore we must rely on the dogmas of faith. But actually, when he comes to any question, as perhaps some will have noticed, of moral philosophy, and especially any question of public order, morality, as he does in his argument for toleration, Bayle will habitually say, well, actually, faith can't really help us with this, so let's rely on reason. And this is a recurrent practice in his... Bayle's moral philosophy is neither skeptical nor based on faith, and this must have been, I think, very clear to Leibniz. Bayle was perhaps especially pernicious in Leibniz's view because this way of separating faith from reason renders belief unreasonable, so that many readers are likely to become convinced of the objections, the powerful objections that Bayle makes for giving rational explanations, seeking to justify or failing to justify God's procedures, and becoming convinced that Bayle's objections are strong ones. They are, as Leibniz puts it, liable to draw dangerous conclusions. So this is a very polite way of saying, I think, that Bayle is a dangerous, pernicious, and subversive force who is going to have the effect of undermining the faith of a large number of readers, which indeed is, of course, exactly what does happen in the 18th century. Hence, readers taking Bayle's fideism seriously and respecting it may be said to be at fault. So, in other words, whether you take Bayle's fideism seriously or not, you're still at fault for being unaware of the serious consequences of such a position. Such people do not see that, properly speaking, God's justice is overthrown by Bayle's position and God rendered unworthy of being venerated. For what idea shall we form of such a justice as has only will for its rule? That is to say, where the will is not guided by the rules of good and even tends directly towards evil. Here too, Leibniz is being powerfully philosophical and practical at the same time. Is it not a brilliant insight into the philosophical disputes of the late 17th century, especially those surrounding Bayle, to see that those many persons coming under his spell, as he puts it, will soon abandon maxims so strange and so unfit to make men good and charitable through the imitation of God, and consequently be liable to lapse into free thinking or atheism. Even if it had not been the case in the past, in the Enlightenment context, Leibniz rightly insists one could confront neither the free thinker nor the atheist without attributing to the true God sentiments rendering him worthy to be called the good principle. The point I chiefly want to emphasize in my lecture is that the Theodicy was not just a peak of early Enlightenment thought, but an eminently didactic and carefully targeted polemical exercise, a book that was practical politically, morally, educationally, as well as a critique of conventional religion and free thinking. It's a point that requires stressing. For instance, Catherine Wilson points out in her 1989 study, Leibniz Metaphysics, in the 20th century, the Theodicy has, for the most part, been regarded as a long, pedantic, and dilettante-ish book, which tries to defend the incredible theory that the world is the best of all possible worlds. The doctrine that the universe is morally neutral and neither good nor evil, she writes, is, since the work of Hume and others, the accepted position from which departures must be justified. Yes, I would comment, but this only proves how modern philosophy tends to falsify our perspective on past societies. For Hume's general philosophy, the evidence of reading habits and the evidence of actual disputes in the mid-18th century shows was accepted by practically nobody during the middle part of the Enlightenment. And Hume was influential, certainly, but almost entirely as a social, economic, and political critic, also as a historian, which he was very famous, and to a limited extent as a moral philosopher. But his philosophy as such was embraced by only one or two towards the end of the century. Men like Rehburg and Jacobi in Germany, who were certainly willing to take it seriously, but that's not till the 1780s. And also, these were men who recognized Hume's uses for social conservatives and the linkage of Hume's philosophy with social conservatism, something which I think neither historians nor philosophers have stressed enough so far. Though generally recognized as a great man, Hume was astoundingly lacking in impact on general debate during the Enlightenment era down to the end of the 18th century, or down to 1800, you could say effectively. This is true, well, it may not be altogether true of Scotland, but it's certainly true of America and England, as well as Western Europe generally. Besides, Hume, like Kant, thought that even if reason cannot prove our world is or is not morally neutral, we must nevertheless pretend the universe is guided for the best by divine providence. That's inherent in Hume, just as it is in Kant. We must pretend that the universe is guided for the best by divine providence if the moral order is to be upheld. So even Hume and Kant are not really exceptions to the rule that all conservative and moderate thinkers of the Enlightenment, without any exception at all, base the moral, social, and political order on the assumption most people made, and perhaps make still, even if Hume personally didn't, that the world is providentially guided and ordered for the best. Leibniz, accordingly, was being profoundly realistic, representative, and pragmatic in the Theodicy, not only in representing the philosophical world and religious difficulties of his time in exactly the light they needed to be viewed in from a moderate Enlightenment standpoint, but also throughout his Theodicy in singling out Bayle and Spinoza as the two thinkers blocking not just his solution to the Theodicy problem, but the basic assumptions of all Christian, for that matter also Jewish and Muslim society. For even restricting the scope of reason in the far-reaching ways Hume and Kant accomplished still leaves each of us morally facing a profound metaphysical either-or question. Either the world is guided by a benevolent divine providence, or it isn't, that one simply can't evade. Pretending or merely assuming, as Phidias skeptics do, that religion is true and that there is a God who delivered morality and rewards or punishes men for their misdeeds, and postulating that this is what practical reason decrees, is, according to Leibniz as well as Spinoza, is philosophically ultimately unsatisfactory. Several participants in the Pantheismusstreit of the 1780s, as several participants in the Pantheismusstreit recognized, Kant's solution does not ultimately remove Spinoza's challenge. In fact, Spinoza's challenge to the providential conception of the world seems to escalate in an extraordinary way, whereas almost all the other great philosophers of the late 17th century ceased to be topical in the way that they had been in controversies and debates in the second half of the 18th century. Broadly speaking, Bayle, who'd made such an enormous impact on the first half of the 18th century, is not so topical and not discussed nearly so much in the second half. Hobbes, who's so fundamental for the late 17th century and first half of the 18th century, Hobbes is not discussed very much. It's not very topical, is not inherently central to big debates in the second half of the 18th century. Neither is Descartes. Even Leibniz, in a way, although he still is very central down to the onset or the advent of Kantianism as a powerful cultural force in the 1780s, is gradually fading into the background by the last years of the 18th century, certainly. Actually, Spinoza is the only survivor from what you might call the veteran greats of the, of the philosophical revolution of the late 17th century, who is moving in the other direction, is escalating, not only in Germany. There's this Spinoza strike